The scorching desert sun beat down mercilessly on Silver City as Catherine Miller stood at her father's window, watching dust devils dance across the parched earth. The governor's mansion, a stark white edifice rising above the modest adobe buildings, offered little comfort despite its grandeur. Her father, William Miller, had used his position as territorial governor to amass both wealth and enemies, though Catherine knew only fragments of his dealings with the Mexican revolutionaries south of the border. The year was 1875, and the discovery of massive gold deposits in the hills surrounding Silver City had transformed the sleepy frontier town into a powder keg of competing interests. Prospectors, merchants, and desperados flooded the streets, while her father's mercenaries, led by the ruthless Jake Thompson, maintained an iron grip on claim rights and water access. Catherine had watched it all from her gilded cage, increasingly troubled by the darkness she glimpsed in her father's empire. Through her window, she observed a cloud of dust approaching from the south, riders moving fast and purposeful. Among them was James Davis, her father's spy master, returning from his latest mission beyond the border. Catherine's heart quickened. James had been tracking the movements of General Samuel Wilson, the legendary Mexican revolutionary whose forces controlled vast territories south of the Rio Grande. Despite her father's warnings, Catherine found herself drawn to stories of the charismatic rebel leader. The mansion's heavy oak door burst open as James Davis strode into the governor's study, his boots leaving trails of red dust across imported Persian carpets. "Governor Miller, we've confirmed it. Wilson's daughter Elizabeth is traveling north with a small escort. She'll pass within 20 miles of Silver City 3 days from now." Catherine pressed herself against the wall beside the door, holding her breath as she listened to the men plot. Her father's laugh sent chills down her spine. "Perfect. Jake Thompson and his men will intercept them in Dead Man's Canyon. Bring the girl here. She'll be our insurance policy against her father's interference with our mining operations." William Miller's voice carried the cold calculation that had made him both wealthy and feared. Catherine's mind raced as she pieced together her father's scheme to kidnap Elizabeth Wilson, the daughter of the very man whose forces could destroy everything they'd built. As evening fell over Silver City, Catherine made her way to the stables, where Thomas Johnson, the young stablemaster, was brushing down her favorite mare. Unlike the mercenaries and corrupt officials who surrounded her father, Thomas had always shown her kindness, sharing stories of his travels across the frontier. Tonight, his eyes held concern as she approached. "Miss Miller, you shouldn't be out here alone. Strange things are brewing. Jake Thompson's men are preparing for some kind of mission." Catherine trusted Thomas with a confidence she rarely extended to others. "They're going to kidnap Elizabeth Wilson, the Revolutionary General's daughter." "My father?" She hesitated, the weight of betrayal heavy in her chest. "My father is behind it all. The gold mines, the water rights, everything. He's using Jake Thompson's men to terrorize honest people on both sides of the border." Thomas's face hardened as he absorbed her words, his hands stilling on the horse's flank. The following morning, Catherine rose before dawn, her mind made up. She couldn't allow her father's schemes to destroy more lives. With Thomas's help, she had prepared supplies and mapped out the route to Dead Man's Canyon. If she could reach Elizabeth Wilson first, warn her of the ambush. The thought of defying her father terrified her, but the alternative, remaining complicit in his crimes, was unbearable. As she slipped out of the mansion in the gray pre-dawn light, Catherine caught sight of Jake Thompson's men gathering by the livery stable, checking weapons and saddles. Their leader stood apart, his scarred face twisted in a perpetual sneer as he issued orders. She had always feared Thompson, sensing in him a cruelty that matched her father's ambition. Now, watching him prepare to hunt down an innocent woman, Catherine's fear crystallized into determination. The desert stretched endlessly before her as Catherine urged her horse south, the rising sun at her back. She carried with her not just supplies and warnings, but also detailed records of her father's operations, ledgers, and letters that proved his corruption. In her heart, she knew this journey marked the end of her old life. Ahead lay uncertainty, danger, and the chance to finally fight for justice in a land torn apart by greed and power. The desert wind whipped Catherine's dark hair as she guided her horse through narrow canyons, carefully choosing paths that would mask her tracks from Thompson's men. Her father's connections stretched far, but she knew these borderlands held secrets hidden trails and forgotten mining camps where a fugitive could disappear. The leather satchel containing the damning documents pressed against her side, a constant reminder of her purpose. As the sun climbed higher, the heat became oppressive. Catherine spotted an abandoned silver mine entrance tucked into a shadowy cliff face. She had heard whispers of these mines from the workers who passed through Silver City, maze-like tunnels that connected to underground springs, used by smugglers and revolutionaries. The cool darkness offered temporary shelter and a chance to rest her horse while checking her bearings. Inside the mine, Catherine found evidence of recent activity, fresh boot prints in the dust and the remnants of a campfire. She tensed, hand moving to the revolver at her hip when a voice emerged from the shadows. "You're a long way from civilization, señorita." An elderly prospector named Thomas stepped into view, his weathered face kind despite his rough appearance. He had been one of her father's first victims when the gold rush began, driven from his legitimate claim by false accusations and hired guns. Thomas listened gravely as Catherine explained her situation and showed him portions of the evidence she carried. "Your father's men will be watching the main roads to Tombstone and Fort Worth," he said, spreading out a crude map drawn on leather. "But there's an old mission trail that leads south through Apache territory. Few dare to use it anymore, but it might be your best chance." He marked the route with a piece of charcoal, his hands steady despite their age. The sound of distant hoofbeats echoed through the canyon, and Catherine's heart raced. Thompson's men had picked up her trail faster than expected. Thomas quickly gathered his few possessions, leading her deeper into the mine through a narrow passage. "There's an outlet on the other side of the ridge," he whispered. "I'll lead them north while you head south. The mission trail starts near the old oak grove in Devil's Canyon." Catherine wanted to protest, knowing the danger Thomas was placing himself in, but the old prospector's expression brooked no argument. He pressed a small leather pouch into her hands, gold dust and nuggets, his life's savings. "There's a woman in Abilene, name of Elizabeth. She runs a boarding house but used to ride with revolutionaries in her youth. Show her these documents, tell her Thomas sent you. She'll know how to get word to the right people." As Catherine emerged from the hidden tunnel into a different canyon, she heard shots echoing in the distance. Tears stung her eyes as she thought of Thomas's sacrifice, but she forced herself to focus on the path ahead. The mission trail would be treacherous, but it represented her best hope of exposing her father's crimes and preventing more bloodshed in these contested lands. The sun was setting when Catherine finally located the old oak grove, ancient trees twisted toward the sky like gnarled hands, their shadows creating strange patterns on the rocky ground. She found the trail markers Thomas had described, small crosses carved into the trunks, barely visible unless you knew where to look. The path ahead disappeared into increasingly wild territory, where her father's influence meant nothing against more primal dangers. Making camp that night in a sheltered hollow, Catherine studied the documents by firelight. The ledgers revealed a complex web of bribes, threats, and murders stretching back years. Her father had built his empire on stolen claims and broken lives, using the chaos of the gold rush to seize power. But it was the letters that truly chilled her. Correspondence with corrupt officials in both countries, plotting to trigger conflicts that would let them seize even more land and resources. Dawn brought new challenges as Catherine continued south. The mission trail was badly eroded in places, forcing her to lead her horse carefully along steep slopes. She rationed her water carefully, knowing that the next reliable spring was still days away. But with each mile, she felt the weight of her old identity falling away. She was no longer the governor's dutiful daughter, but something new. A fugitive, a truth seeker, perhaps even an avenger for those her father had wronged. As the sun climbed higher, Catherine spotted dust clouds on the horizon, riders moving fast along the old trading route. Her heart quickened as she recognized the purposeful formation. Her father's men would be methodically searching every trail and watercourse, knowing the desert would eventually force her toward civilization. She guided her horse into a narrow box canyon, where weathered petroglyphs hinted at ancient peoples who had also sought refuge in these stone corridors. The saddlebags containing the damning documents felt heavier with each passing hour. Not just paper anymore, but the weight of lives destroyed and justice denied. She thought of Sarah, her childhood friend whose family had mysteriously abandoned their profitable claim after refusing to sell to her father. Now she understood the true story behind their disappearance, documented in clinical detail in those leather-bound ledgers. As evening approached, Catherine made her way to a hidden spring she'd discovered in happier times during one of her solitary rides exploring the borderlands. The scorching desert sun beat down mercilessly on Silver City as Catherine Rodriguez slipped through the shadows of its dusty alleyways. 3 weeks had passed since her daring escape from the mercenaries who'd snatched her from her father's hacienda. The daughter of General Antonio Rodriguez had proven far more resourceful than her captors expected. But now she found herself trapped between her father's advancing army and the corrupt forces of Governor James Thompson. Through the grimy window of the Silver City Assay Office, Catherine watched as Thomas Miller, the governor's chief enforcer, handed out wanted posters bearing her likeness. The reward had doubled again, $10,000 now for information leading to her capture. She pulled her hat lower, the stolen men's clothes concealing her identity, as she contemplated her next move. The discovery of major gold deposits in the territory had turned this border dispute into something far more dangerous. Samuel Davis, a young prospector with kind eyes and a nervous demeanor, had become Catherine's unlikely ally after finding her hiding in his mining camp. He'd been horrified to learn of Governor Thompson's scheme to provoke war with Mexico as a pretext for seizing the newly discovered gold deposits south of the border. Now Samuel helped smuggle information to Catherine about the governor's movements while maintaining his cover as a simple miner. The evening brought welcome relief from the heat as Catherine made her way to the abandoned church on the outskirts of town. There, she'd established a hideout in the bell tower, from which she could observe the comings and goings of the governor's men. A small group of Mexican workers and sympathetic Americans had begun gathering there as well, drawn to her mission of exposing Thompson's corruption and preventing unnecessary bloodshed. Jake Wilson, a former Texas Ranger turned private investigator, had been hired by the Territorial Assembly to look into allegations against the governor. Catherine watched him carefully from her perch as he interviewed merchants in the plaza below. She'd learned to be wary of everyone, but something about Wilson's methodical approach and apparent immunity to Thompson's bribes intrigued her. Perhaps he could become another valuable ally. The sound of approaching horses sent Catherine deeper into the shadows of the bell tower. William Johnson, the governor's personal secretary, rode past with several armed men. Catherine had discovered Johnson was the one who'd arranged her kidnapping, hoping to force her father's hand. The secretary's saddlebags often contained documents that could expose the whole conspiracy, if only she could get her hands on them. Mary Miller, Thomas Miller's wife and the local schoolteacher, had become an unexpected source of help. She'd witnessed her husband's descent into corruption and now secretly provided Catherine with details of meetings held at their home. Tonight's note, passed through Samuel, warned of a large shipment of weapons being smuggled to mercenaries positioned along the border, meant to ambush her father's approaching forces. The discovery of gold in the Devil's Canyon had set everything in motion. Governor Thompson had learned of the massive deposits from geological surveys, but kept them secret while orchestrating an elaborate scheme to secure the rights. Catherine had found proof in stolen documents that he'd been systematically cheating Mexican landowners out of their claims for months before arranging her kidnapping. Elizabeth Davis, Samuel's sister and a telegraph operator, intercepted a coded message revealing that Thompson had promised the mercenaries a share of the gold rights in exchange for creating border incidents that would justify military intervention. Catherine's blood boiled at the thought of how many innocent lives would be lost to satisfy the governor's greed. She began formulating a plan to strike at the heart of his operation. As night fell over Silver City, Catherine heard the distinctive sound of her father's cavalry scouts exchanging signals in the distance. Time was running out. If she couldn't find a way to expose Thompson's plot soon, the territory would erupt in violence. She had no intention of letting that happen. Tomorrow she would make her first major move against the governor's conspiracy, a bold raid that would shake his confidence and show others that resistance was possible. Sarah Wilson, Jake's wife and the owner of the local newspaper, had begun printing subtle hints about corruption in the governor's office. Catherine admired the woman's courage, knowing Thompson's men had already threatened the paper once. She decided to risk making contact, hoping to use the newspaper as a way to spread the truth about the gold discoveries and the false border crisis. The next morning brought news that changed everything. Emma Thompson, the governor's own daughter, had approached Samuel at the assay office requesting a secret meeting with Catherine. The young woman claimed to have evidence of her father's crimes and wanted to prevent the coming bloodshed. Catherine knew it could be a trap, but the possibility of accessing the governor's private papers was too tempting to ignore. Catherine arranged to meet Emma, at an abandoned mining shack 3 miles outside Silver City, taking every precaution against a potential ambush. The desert wind whipped sand against the weathered boards as she approached, her horse's hooves muffled by the soft ground. Through her spyglass, she studied the surrounding ridgelines and saw no sign of Thompson's men, though that meant little given their skill at concealment. Emma arrived alone on horseback as promised, her proper riding habit incongruous against the rugged landscape. Catherine noted how the governor's daughter sat her horse with the ease of someone raised in the saddle, not some pampered Eastern belle. The young woman's face showed strain as she dismounted, glancing nervously over her shoulder at the empty desert behind her. "I've brought ledgers from my father's study," Emma said without preamble, pulling documents from her saddlebags. "He doesn't know I found them. They detail payments to the mercenaries, bribes to officials, even orders to fabricate reports of Mexican troop movements." Her hands trembled slightly as she handed over the papers, but her voice remained steady. Catherine saw steel beneath the refined exterior. The documents proved more damning than Catherine had dared hope. Governor Thompson had orchestrated an elaborate scheme, using the false threat of Mexican invasion to justify seizing newly discovered gold deposits along the disputed border. The mercenaries weren't just hired guns. They were his private army, tasked with terrorizing Mexican settlers off their valid claims. Sarah Wilson's newspaper office became their war room as Catherine and Emma worked to expose the truth. They met in secret after dark, poring over the evidence and planning how best to reveal it. Sarah's husband Jake provided security, his steady presence a comfort as they documented the governor's crimes. The friendship forming between the three women surprised Catherine. Emma's privilege hadn't blinded her to injustice. But Thompson's men were watching. One night, Catherine spotted William, the governor's most ruthless enforcer, lurking near the newspaper office. She circled back through the shadows of Silver City's back alleys, drawing him away from Sarah and Emma. The pursuit led her into the maze-like remains of the old silver mines, where she finally lost him in the twisting tunnels. The close call forced them to accelerate their plans. Sarah began printing a series of explosive exposés, while Emma gathered more evidence from the governor's mansion. Catherine used her growing network of supporters to protect witnesses willing to testify about Thompson's schemes, but they knew the governor would soon realize his own daughter had betrayed him. The breaking point came when Thompson's men ransacked the newspaper office, destroying the printing press and leaving Jake badly beaten. Sarah and Emma barely escaped through a back window as the building burned. Catherine led them to a safe house in the hills, where Samuel had established a hidden camp for those opposing the governor's corruption. As they tended Jake's wounds that night, Emma revealed that her father had arranged to sell mining rights to Eastern investors, planning to clear out all existing claims by force if necessary. The mercenaries were massing for a major operation that would drive hundreds of families from their homes and likely trigger the very border war Thompson claimed to be preventing. Catherine studied the desert valley below their hideout, remembering her own family's suffering at the hands of powerful men who twisted the law to their purpose. The time for subtle resistance had passed. Tomorrow they would strike directly at Thompson's operation, targeting the mercenaries' main camp outside Tombstone. Emma's inside knowledge would be crucial, though using it meant she could never return to her old life. Sarah insisted on accompanying them, her determination to expose the truth undiminished by the attack. As they made their plans, Catherine saw the same fire in both women's eyes that burned in her own. Thompson had created this crisis to feed his greed, never imagining that his greatest opponents would be three women fighting for justice in their own ways, with words, with evidence, and when necessary, with weapons. The desert night grew cold as they finalized the details of tomorrow's raid. Catherine knew the governor's response would be savage once he realized his own daughter had helped plan it. But Emma showed no fear, only quiet resolve as she memorized the guard rotations she would help them exploit. Their small rebellion was about to become open war, and none of them would emerge unchanged. The scorching sun hung like molten gold over Silver City as Catherine Rodriguez surveyed the bustling mining camp from her hidden vantage point in the scrub-covered hills. 3 weeks had passed since her daring escape from Governor Wilson's compound, and in that time, she had transformed from a diplomat's sheltered daughter into something entirely different. A ghost that haunted the desert, striking at the corrupt power structure that had tried to cage her. The rough canvas of her stolen work clothes scratched against sun-bronzed skin as she adjusted her position, watching the guards patrol the perimeter of the massive gold processing facility below. Her father's revolutionary army was still days away, but Catherine knew she couldn't wait. The evidence of Wilson's illegal gold trafficking operation was here, and with it, the proof that would expose his scheme to provoke war with Mexico over fabricated border raids. William Thompson, the facility's foreman, emerged from the main office building, mopping his brow with a bandana. Catherine's fingers tightened around her binoculars as she watched him bark orders at the workers. He had been there the night they took her, his aristocratic face twisted with cruel amusement as Governor Wilson's mercenaries dragged her from her bed. Now he managed the operation that was funneling millions in stolen gold across the territory. The sound of approaching hoofbeats made Catherine duck lower behind the rocks. A cloud of dust announced the arrival of Jake Miller, the mercenary captain who had led her kidnapping. His dozen riders formed a protective circle around a covered wagon as it rolled through the facility gates. Catherine allowed herself a grim smile. Right on schedule. The monthly shipment of processed gold was heading out, and with it, her chance to strike a decisive blow. The past weeks had taught her much about survival in this harsh land. She had found unlikely allies among the displaced Mexican miners and their families, forced from their claims by Wilson's men. They had taught her to move like a shadow through the desert, to read the subtle signs of pursuit in disturbed earth and bent grass. Most importantly, they had shown her how to fight back against the overwhelming power of corrupt men. As darkness fell over the desert, Catherine made her way down to the ramshackle tent city where the dispossessed miners lived. In one of the larger tents, she found Sarah Davis, a widow whose husband had died defending their claim from Wilson's takeover. Sarah had become both friend and conspirator, using her position as a laundress at the facility to gather intelligence about guard rotations and shipment schedules. "They're moving the gold tonight," Sarah whispered, passing Catherine a bundle of clean clothes. "William Thompson is personally overseeing the loading. Jake Miller's men will escort it to Fort Worth, where the governor's agents will officially discover it and claim it was smuggled in from Mexico." Her eyes gleamed with contained fury. "They're planning to use it as evidence that your father is funding raids across the border." Catherine nodded grimly as she changed into the laundress outfit. The plan was elegant in its simplicity. Wilson would use the gold as justification to crack down on Mexican settlements throughout the territory, while simultaneously provoking her father into exactly the kind of military response that would justify federal intervention. The resulting conflict would allow the governor and his allies to seize even more land and resources. "Your father's army was spotted crossing the border yesterday," Sarah continued, helping Catherine pin up her dark hair. "The territorial militia is mobilizing to meet them. Wilson's counting on the chaos of battle to cover his tracks." She squeezed Catherine's hand. "Whatever you're planning, it has to happen tonight." Catherine met her friend's worried gaze with steely determination. "It will. By dawn, everyone will know the truth about Wilson's scheme." The next hours passed in a blur of careful preparation. Catherine moved through the facility with practiced invisibility, just another member of the cleaning staff ending their day. She noted the positioning of guards, the patterns of their patrols. Most importantly, she observed the loading of the wagon, memorizing exactly where Thompson's men stowed the damning documentation that would expose the entire operation. As dusk settled over the compound, Catherine slipped into the stables wearing the dark clothes Sarah had provided. The desert wind carried distant sounds of her father's approaching forces, the thunder of hooves and the faint echo of military drums. She knew she had mere hours before the inevitable clash would throw everything into chaos. Methodically checking the saddle straps of the horse she'd chosen, she whispered soothing words to the nervous animal. Through the stable's weathered slats, she observed Wilson's mercenaries loading the last crates onto the wagon, their movements hurried and tense. The documentation inside would prove the governor's illegal land seizures and his plot to incite violence along the border. Catherine's fingers traced the cold steel of the revolver, hidden in her skirts, a final gift from her father before all this began. Sarah appeared at the stable door like a ghost, her face pale in the growing darkness. "The guards are changing shifts now," she whispered. "Thompson's men are distracted by reports of your father's army approaching from the south. If you're going to move, it has to be within the next few minutes." Catherine embraced her friend fiercely, knowing they might never meet again. The compound erupted into motion as Catherine mounted her horse. Shouts rang out from the western wall. Her father's scouts had been spotted closer than expected. In the confusion, she guided her mount through the shadows toward the wagon. Two guards remained, but their attention was fixed on the commotion at the perimeter. With practiced grace, she swung down beside the vehicle. Her hands moved swiftly through the cargo, locating the oilskin packet containing Wilson's correspondence and ledgers. The sound of gunfire erupted from the direction of Silver City. The first skirmish had begun. Catherine's heart pounded as she secured the documents and remounted. But a voice suddenly cut through the darkness. "Stop right there, señorita." Thompson emerged from behind the stable, his gun trained steadily on her chest. "I've been expecting something like this," he drawled. "The governor's going to be disappointed. He had such plans for using you to control your father." Catherine's horse shifted nervously beneath her as more guards approached, surrounding her in a tightening circle. A sudden explosion rocked the compound's main gate, sending guards scrambling for cover. Through the smoke, Catherine glimpsed familiar figures, her father's men creating a diversion. Without hesitation, she spurred her horse forward, ducking as Thompson's shot whistled past her ear. The animal's powerful stride carried them through the chaos, hooves thundering against packed earth. Behind her, horses gave chase through the desert night. Catherine pressed low against her mount's neck, the precious documents secured inside her jacket. She guided her horse toward the maze-like arroyos she'd studied during her captivity, knowing her pursuers would have to slow their pace in the treacherous terrain. The sound of pursuit gradually faded as she navigated the twisting passages. Dawn found her miles from the compound, watching from a high ridge as columns of dust marked troop movements in the valley below. Her father's forces had engaged Wilson's militia near Tombstone, but the real victory was already won. The documents she carried would expose the corruption to newspapers in every major city from Fort Worth to San Francisco. Catherine turned her horse toward Abilene, where she knew sympathetic journalists awaited. The story of the governor's conspiracy would spark outrage on both sides of the border. But more importantly, it would protect the lands and rights of people who had suffered under his corrupt rule. She had become something more than a hostage or a revolutionary's daughter. She was now a defender of justice in her own right. In the years that followed, her legend grew. Some called her the Desert Rose, others the Shadow Rider. But to those she helped, the displaced farmers, the cheated miners, the Native American tribes, she was simply Catherine, the woman who dared to challenge power and won. The corrupt governor eventually faced prosecution, and the borderlands found a measure of peace, thanks to a daughter's courage and a father's love. The autumn winds swept across the desert as Catherine rode through the night toward Abilene, the precious document secured inside her leather satchel. Though her immediate mission was accomplished, she knew the real battle was just beginning. The governor's allies wouldn't surrender their power without a fight, and already she could sense riders on her trail, mercenaries desperate to silence the truth before it could spread. Through the moonlit canyon passages, she recalled her father's words about patience being a warrior's greatest weapon. Rather than race straight to Abilene, she diverted west towards Silver City, knowing her pursuers would expect her to take the direct route. The extra days of travel were worth the tactical advantage, and she had allies among the silver miners who would shelter her. In a hidden arroyo outside Silver City, she met with James, a former marshal turned newspaperman who had been investigating the governor's dealings for months. His eyes widened as he reviewed the documents by lantern light. Land deeds, forged treaties, receipts for bribes paid to officials on both sides of the border. "This is exactly what we needed," he whispered. "But they'll try to discredit you, claim you're just a foreign agitator." Catherine smiled grimly as she checked her rifle. "Let them try. The truth has its own power, and I have friends in every town from here to Fort Worth who will stand behind these accusations." She thought of the network of allies she'd built, merchants, ranchers, telegraph operators, all of them victims of the governor's schemes who now formed her web of intelligence and support. The dawn painted Tombstone's weathered buildings in shades of amber, and rose as Catherine Rodriguez surveyed the chaos below from her vantage point atop Miller's General Store. The past months of guerrilla warfare between her father's revolutionaries and the corrupt Governor Thompson's mercenaries had transformed the once quiet mining town into a powder keg. She adjusted the bandolier across her chest, the gold stolen from Thompson's private vault weighing heavily against her heart. William Davis, the governor's chief enforcer, had sealed off the streets with his men, determined to prevent Catherine's escape and crush the rebellion that had spread like wildfire through the territory. But he didn't understand that the very gold he'd helped Thompson steal from Mexican mines had become the seed of his destruction. Catherine had ensured every ounce she'd liberated found its way back to the communities the governor had terrorized. Below, James Miller emerged from his store, nervously eyeing the armed men positioned at every corner. He'd been Catherine's unlikely ally since the beginning, when she'd first escaped her captors and stumbled into his shop half-dead from the desert heat. The old shopkeeper had risked everything to hide her, and now his store had become the headquarters of her growing resistance movement. The morning stillness shattered as shots rang out from the south end of town. Catherine recognized the distinctive crack of her father's rifles. General Rodriguez's forces had finally arrived. But instead of the full-scale assault Thompson's men expected, this was merely a diversion. The real attack would come from the network of old mining tunnels that honeycombed the earth beneath Tombstone. Sarah Wilson crouched beside Catherine, her doctor's bag filled with ammunition instead of medicines these days. The former Army nurse had thrown in her lot with the resistance after treating too many victims of Thompson's brutality. "The tunnels are ready," she whispered. "Jake and the others are in position." Catherine nodded, remembering how the young miner had mapped out every underground passage, creating an invisible highway for their operations. The air grew thick with gun smoke as William Davis's men returned fire, focusing their attention on the southern approach. Catherine gave the signal, and dozens of figures emerged from cellars and back doors throughout town. Shopkeepers, miners, farmers, all of them ready to reclaim their home from Thompson's tyranny. The months of careful planning were finally bearing fruit. In the governor's mansion, Thomas Thompson paced nervously, watching his carefully constructed empire crumble. The telegraph lines were cut, the railroad blocked, and his private army was being systematically dismantled by a combination of Mexican revolutionaries and his own citizens. The irony of being undone by the very people he'd oppressed wasn't lost on him. The fighting intensified as Catherine's forces pushed through the streets, driving Thompson's men back in carefully coordinated maneuvers. Elizabeth Johnson, the schoolteacher who'd been secretly training townspeople in military tactics for months, directed the civilian fighters with remarkable precision. Her previous life as a Confederate cavalry officer was a secret she'd shared only with Catherine. Through the smoke and chaos, Catherine caught glimpses of familiar faces: Samuel Wilson running ammunition to the barricades, Mary Davis tending to the wounded, and countless others who'd joined her cause. These weren't just fighters anymore, they were family, bound together by shared suffering and an unshakable determination to see justice done. The battle reached its crescendo as General Rodriguez's forces breached the town's southern defenses. Catherine led her group toward the governor's mansion, moving through the tunnels Jake had prepared. The underground passage emerged in Thompson's private study, where they found the governor attempting to burn incriminating documents. William Davis made his final stand in the mansion's marble-floored foyer, his loyalty to Thompson bought with blood money and false promises. The firefight that followed would be remembered in Tombstone for generations. Not for its violence, but for the moment Davis realized he'd been fighting for the wrong side all along. As the sun set over Tombstone, Catherine stood in the governor's office, watching Thompson being led away in chains. The documents they'd recovered proved his corruption extended far beyond the territory, reaching into the highest levels of government. Her father embraced her, pride and relief evident in his weathered features. The aftermath brought changes no one had expected. The territory's governance was reformed, with James Miller elected as interim governor. Sarah Wilson established a proper hospital, while Elizabeth Johnson's school became a symbol of the new order. The gold mines were returned to their rightful owners, operated under fair conditions Jake helped establish. Catherine's legend grew, but she refused to rest. Other territories needed help. Other corrupt officials needed to face justice. She built a network of allies across the frontier, transforming from a kidnapped daughter into a symbol of revolution and hope. The desert winds carried her story far and wide, inspiring others to stand against tyranny. The story of Tombstone's liberation became part of frontier mythology. But the truth was far more remarkable than any tale told around campfires. It wasn't just about good triumphing over evil. It was about community, sacrifice, and the extraordinary power of ordinary people standing together against injustice. Years passed, and Catherine's influence spread far beyond Tombstone's dusty streets. She established a vast network of informants and allies stretching from Silver City to Fort Worth, each outpost becoming a sanctuary for those seeking justice. Her father's revolutionary spirit had transformed into something uniquely American, a blend of frontier independence and Mexican dignity that transcended borders. The corrupt officials who once thought themselves untouchable now lived in fear of her shadow. Jake had become her most trusted partner, their relationship evolving from reluctant allies to something deeper. Together, they uncovered a pattern of corruption, linking several territorial banks to a syndicate of former Confederate officers operating out of Abilene. The scheme threatened to destabilize the entire region's economy, affecting both American settlers and Mexican communities alike. Sarah Wilson's hospital in Tombstone had grown into a proper medical center, treating patients regardless of their background or ability to pay. She trained a new generation of nurses, including Emma, who had once been among Catherine's first followers. The hospital became a crucial part of their network, providing care to injured fighters while maintaining plausible deniability about their patients' activities. William, the former sheriff who had helped expose the governor's corruption, now served as a liaison between Catherine's organization and legitimate law enforcement. His position allowed him to channel information about criminal activities while ensuring that innocent people weren't caught in the crossfire. His reputation for honesty made him invaluable in distinguishing between corrupt officials and those genuinely serving justice. The desert itself seemed to embrace Catherine's cause. She learned its secrets: hidden water sources, forgotten Apache trails, and caves that could shelter dozens. The harsh landscape that had once imprisoned her became her greatest ally. Her riders could appear and disappear like mirages, leaving frustrated posses circling empty arroyos. Elizabeth Johnson's school flourished, becoming a center for more than just education. Under the guise of teaching, she trained young women in self-defense, codes, and the art of gathering intelligence. Many of her graduates joined Catherine's network, creating a web of informed, capable women across the frontier who could defend themselves and their communities. James Miller's reforms as interim governor had lasting effects, but the fight for justice wasn't over. New threats emerged from railroad companies attempting to seize land from small ranchers and Mexican settlements. Catherine's organization evolved to meet these challenges, using legal means when possible, but maintaining the ability to act decisively when corruption overwhelmed the system. Thomas, who had initially helped Catherine escape her captors, established a series of safe houses between Silver City and Fort Worth. These waypoints became crucial for moving information and protecting those who dared to stand against powerful interests. Each location was carefully chosen and maintained by local families who shared their vision of a just frontier. The gold mines that had sparked the original conflict now operated under a complex trust, ensuring fair distribution of profits among workers and preventing any single group from gaining too much control. Jake's experience in mining helped establish practices that became a model for other operations across the territory, proving that prosperity didn't require exploitation. Catherine never forgot her father's revolutionary ideals, but she had created something unique, a movement that crossed borders and cultures, united by a common desire for justice. Her legend grew not just as a bandit queen, but as a symbol of hope for anyone facing oppression. Stories of her exploits were told in Spanish and English, around campfires and in saloons, growing with each telling but never quite matching the remarkable truth. As their network expanded, Catherine and Jake found themselves spending more time planning than fighting. They established a council of trusted allies, including Sarah, Elizabeth, and William, to ensure their organization remained true to its principles. Their meetings, held in secret locations across the territory, became forums for addressing the frontier's evolving challenges. The harsh desert winds that had once carried dust and despair now seemed to whisper stories of hope. In remote villages and growing towns alike, people spoke of justice riding on horseback, of a woman who had transformed personal vengeance into a mission of liberation. Catherine's legacy wasn't just in the battles she won, but in the communities she helped build. Places where people of all backgrounds could live with dignity and without fear.